The case that shook the monarchy to its very core, but tonight it's over. And tonight, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's former protection officers are being urged to come forward.
Surfaced quietly, buried details no one expected to return. A past carefully managed, now slipping beyond control, and inside the palace, the fallout has already begun. The discovery that changed the narrative. It did not begin with a headline. There was no immediate broadcast, no urgent interruption, no visible signal to the outside world that something significant had just shifted beneath the surface of the monarchy. Instead, it began the way these moments often do, quietly, almost cautiously, inside a system that has long relied on control, timing, and distance. In the final days of February 2026, a briefing document circulated among a very limited group within Buckingham Palace. It was not marked as extraordinary. It did not carry the tone of alarm, but those who read it understood, almost instantly, that something within it did not belong to the past. It belonged to the present. The document itself was structured with familiar precision, clean lines, verified sources, carefully attributed references, nothing speculative, nothing exaggerated. And yet, what it outlined had the potential to reopen a chapter that many had assumed, perhaps hoped, was already closed. It concerned Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, not in the way he had been discussed before, not through the lens of already examined controversies or previously navigated scrutiny, but through something older, something less defined, and in many ways more difficult to contain. At the center of the document was a collection of newly surfaced material, records, correspondence, fragments of association that had, until now, remained outside the reach of both public narrative and institutional response. Individually, each element might have seemed manageable, but taken together, they formed something else entirely. A pattern, not one that could be easily dismissed as coincidence, and not one that aligned comfortably with the version of events that had, over time, been established and defended. For those within the palace who reviewed the material, the concern was not immediate scandal. It was something more controlled, but potentially more damaging. Credibility. Because the monarchy does not operate solely on fact, it operates on perception. And perception, once unsettled, has a way of shifting faster than any formal response can contain. The timing of the discovery only heightened its significance. This was not a moment of relative calm. The institution, nay, already navigating a period of recalibration, adjusting its public role, redefining internal boundaries, managing generational transition, was not positioned to absorb unexpected disruption without consequence. And yet, disruption had arrived, not loudly, but undeniably. Within hours of the document's circulation, a second layer of review was initiated. Legal advisors were brought in, not to react publicly, but to assess privately. The questions they were asked were precise. What exposure existed? What connections could be verified? And perhaps most critically, what could not be disproven? Because in situations such as this, certainty is not always the determining factor. Sometimes the absence of clear denial carries equal weight. Communications teams, though not yet activated, were quietly alerted. No statements were drafted. No positions were announced, but the awareness was there. Something was coming, or perhaps more accurately, something had already arrived, and the palace was now in the position of deciding how or whether it could be contained. At this stage, Andrew himself had not yet been formally briefed. That too was deliberate, because before the information reached him, it needed to be understood, fully, precisely, and without distortion. The risk of miscalculation, of underestimating the implications, was one the palace could not afford, especially not now. Especially not with material that reached back into a past that had never been entirely settled. Those closest to the process would later describe the atmosphere in those early hours as controlled, but tense, not chaotic, not reactive, but sharpened. Because there was a recognition, quiet, but unmistakable, that this was not simply a matter of revisiting history. It was a matter of confronting something that had, until now, remained just beyond the boundaries of accountability, and once brought into view, it would not easily return to obscurity. By the end of that day, the initial conclusion had been reached. The material was credible. The connections, though complex, were traceable. And the potential impact, should it move beyond the confines of internal review, would be significant. Not explosive, but enduring. the kind of impact that does not fade with a single news cycle, but lingers, expands, reshapes the narrative over time. And so, without announcement, without acknowledgement, the palace entered a new phase, one defined not by what had already been said, but by what had just been discovered. The past that refused to stay buried. What had surfaced in those final days of February did not exist in isolation. It reached backward. Quietly at first, then with increasing clarity, it began to connect itself to moments that had once seemed distant, fragmented and contained within their own time. Events that had been acknowledged, managed, and then gradually absorbed into the background of a much larger institutional narrative. But now, those moments were returning, not as memory, as evidence. The material reviewed within the palace did not rely on speculation. It did not attempt to reinterpret known events through a new lens. Instead, it introduced something far more difficult to navigate: context. Because what had once appeared as isolated incidents began, under closer examination, to reveal a pattern of association that had not been fully understood when first encountered. Connections that, at the time, seemed incidental were now being reconsidered with a different level of scrutiny. And that scrutiny was producing uncomfortable alignment. Some of the records dated back to the late 1990s. Others emerged from the early years of the new century. They were not hidden in the traditional sense. Many had existed in partial form, referenced briefly in past reporting, or acknowledged in passing before being set aside. But what had changed was not the existence of these details, it was their consolidation. For the first time, disparate fragments were being viewed together, without separation, without the distance of time to soften their significance. Correspondence, travel records, and social connections that had once appeared unconnected were now arranged in a way that suggested continuity. And that distinction altered everything. Within the palace, this shift did not create panic. It created focus. Because the challenge was no longer to respond to individual claims. It was to understand the broader narrative that those claims, when combined, were beginning to form. A narrative that extended beyond any single moment and into something far more difficult to contain. For Andrew, the past had long operated within a defined boundary. It was something that could be addressed when necessary, then set aside. Something that could be managed through distance, through time, through the careful balance of acknowledgement and silence. But what had now emerged did not respect those boundaries. It moved between them, it connected them, and in doing so, it began to erode the structure that had previously allowed separation between past and present. Those involved in the internal review began to recognize a pattern that was less about isolated decisions and more about a sustained proximity to individuals and environments that, even at the time, carried risk. Not always visible, not always acknowledged, but present. And with that recognition came a more difficult question, not simply what had happened, but what had been understood at the time. Because if certain associations had been known, even in part, then the issue was no longer limited to hindsight. It extended into judgment, into awareness, into the choices that had been made within that awareness. The palace, careful as ever, did not move toward immediate conclusion. That was never its method. Every element was cross-examined. Every timeline was reconstructed with precision. Where gaps existed, they were noted rather than filled with assumption. But even within that caution, a direction was becoming clear. The past was no longer stable, it was active, and as it became active, it began to exert pressure on the present. Externally, there were early signs that this shift might not remain contained. Journalists, some of whom had previously explored similar territory, were beginning to revisit older threads, not with urgency, but with renewed interest. Questions that had once faded were being asked again, this time with access to a broader context. The difference, though subtle, was significant. Because questions asked in isolation can be managed. And questions asked within a pattern become harder to dismiss. Inside the palace, this possibility was understood immediately. The concern was not the release of a single detail, but the cumulative effect of multiple elements aligning in the public domain. Once that alignment occurred, control would not disappear, but it would weaken. And for an institution that relies as much on timing as it does on substance, even a slight loss of control carries consequence. Andrew's position within this evolving situation was becoming increasingly complex. The version of the past that had been maintained for years was now facing pressure from within. not from external accusation, but from internal reassessment. That distinction mattered. It meant that the challenge was no longer about defending against outside narrative. It was about reconciling internal understanding, and that is always more difficult because it requires not only response, but acknowledgement. As the days progressed, the review continued, carefully, deliberately, but with a growing awareness that what had been uncovered could not simply be returned to where it had been found. It had already begun to move, to connect, to reshape. And once a past begins to reorganize itself in that way, it does not easily return to silence. It remains persistent, unresolved, and increasingly difficult to ignore. The moment the palace was forced to respond. The moment did not arrive with warning. There was no single headline that forced the palace into action. No dramatic revelation that could be isolated and addressed in one controlled statement. Instead, it came as a shift, subtle at first, or then unmistakable. In the opening days of March 2026, the first indications began to surface beyond the controlled boundaries of internal review. A question raised in one publication, a reference almost cautious in tone, appearing in another. Not identical, not coordinated, but connected, because what had previously existed only within the palace was beginning to find its way into the public domain. Not in full, not yet, but enough to signal that containment was no longer guaranteed. Within Buckingham Palace, the response was immediate, though not visible. Meetings were convened without delay. Senior advisors, already familiar with the material, moved from assessment to strategy. The tone shifted from observation to preparation. Because the situation had crossed a threshold, it was no longer internal. It was becoming external, and once that transition begins, the pace changes. Questions began to arrive through official channels, carefully worded, measured in tone, but carrying an underlying persistence that made their intent clear. Was there further information? Could the palace clarify the nature of the connections being referenced? Were previous statements still considered complete? Each question on its own could be managed. Together, they formed pressure, the kind that builds not through intensity, but through repetition. Inside the palace, the first decision was not what to say. It was whether to say anything at all. Silence, long the institution's most effective tool, was considered carefully. In many situations, it allows speculation to dissipate. It avoids giving shape to narratives that might otherwise fade on their own. But this was not one of those situations, because the material now emerging did not rely on speculation alone. It carried structure, and structure, once visible, tends to invite further examination rather than discourage it. Legal advisors were consulted again, this time with a different focus. Not simply what existed, but what could be said about what existed. The distinction was critical. Accuracy was not enough. The language would need to be precise, controlled, and resilient under scrutiny. Communications teams began drafting, not statements, but frameworks. Possible responses that could be adapted depending on how the situation evolved. Each word weighed, each phrase tested for implication. Because in moments like this, what is not said can carry as much meaning as what is. It's at the center of the process was the recognition that delay carried its own risk. To remain entirely silent would suggest uncertainty. To respond too quickly would suggest lack of control. The balance between those 2 points is where the palace operates most carefully. And now, that balance was being tested. Andrew was informed. The briefing was delivered with the same restraint that had defined the earlier stages. No dramatics, no unnecessary detail beyond what was required. But the implications were clear. What had been discovered was no longer contained, and what had been contained could no longer be managed in the same way. His initial reaction, those aware of the exchange would later suggest, was not immediate alarm. It was recognition, a quiet understanding that something from the past had reemerged, and that its return was not accidental. Because this was not a single detail resurfacing, it was a sequence, and sequences have direction. Back at the palace, the final decision was made. There would be a response. Not expansive, not explanatory, but present. A brief statement, carefully constructed, acknowledging awareness of recent reporting, reaffirming previously established positions, and emphasizing that no further comment would be made at this stage. It was released without ceremony, no announcement, no amplification, simply placed into the public space where it would be seen, examined, and interpreted. And with that, the palace stepped into a new phase, one where control still existed, but no longer existed alone. Because once a response is given, the narrative does not end. It evolves, and in this case, it had only just begun. Inside Andrew's private reaction, by the time the palace issued its carefully measured response, the shift had already reached Andrew in a far more personal way. Not through headlines, not through public reaction, but through the quiet, controlled briefing that left little room for interpretation. At Royal Lodge, the atmosphere had changed once again, not abruptly, but with a weight that settled slowly, pressing itself into the rhythm of the day until even the smallest routines began to feel altered. There was no visible disruption to the outside world, no outward sign that anything had shifted. But inside, the effect was immediate. Andrew understood. Not every detail, not every connection that had been uncovered or re-examined, but enough to recognize that this was not a repetition of what had come before. This was something different, because the past, as it had been managed for years, had always operated within a certain distance. It could be addressed, contained, and then allowed to recede. The structure had held. Now, that structure was under pressure. And for the first time, that pressure was coming from within the institution itself. His initial response was controlled, measured. There was no immediate outward reaction, no visible frustration, no sharp dismissal of what had been presented. Instead, there was a stillness that those familiar with his behavior would later describe as deliberate. A pause, not of uncertainty, but of calculation. Questions followed, but they were not emotional, they were precise. What exactly had been uncovered? How far did the material extend? Who had access to it? Each question was answered carefully. These within the limits of what could be shared. There were boundaries, even in this moment. Information was given, but not in full. Enough to inform, not enough to expose every detail. And within those boundaries, Andrew began to assess. Because for him, the situation was no longer abstract. It was immediate. And as the implications began to take shape, the stillness shifted. Not into panic, but into resistance. There was an insistence, at first subtle, then more defined, that the situation could be reframed, that what had been presented did not fully capture the context in which those earlier associations had existed, that fragments, when isolated, could misrepresent the whole. It was not an unfamiliar position. It had been used before, but this time, it met a different response. There was no active pushback, no argument, but also no indication that the framing would alter the course that had already begun. And that absence of engagement carried its own message, because it suggested that the issue was no longer open to reinterpretation. It was being evaluated on a different level. As the day progressed, the tone shifted again. The initial effort to reshape the narrative began to lose momentum, not because the intention had disappeared, but because the structure surrounding it did not respond. The usual pathways through which pressure might be applied or influence exerted remained closed. Calls were considered, some were made, but the outcomes were not what they might once have been. Where there had previously been openness, there was now caution. Where there had been willingness to engage, there was now distance. And in that distance, something began to settle. A realization, gradual but unmistakable, that the position he had relied upon for years was no longer as stable as it had once appeared. That realization did not arrive all at once. It came in stages. In the silence that followed unanswered questions. In the tone of responses that avoided commitment. In the absence of reassurance where reassurance might once have been expected. And as it took hold, the nature of his reaction began to change. The outward resistance gave way to something more internal, less visible, but no less significant. Moments of reflection replaced moments of insistence. The need to challenge gave way, at least in part, to the need to understand. Not only what had been uncovered, but what it meant. Because this was no longer simply about defending the past, and it was about confronting the possibility that the past, once again, was shaping the present in ways that could not be easily redirected. Inside Royal Lodge, the environment reflected that shift. Staff moved with increased care. Conversations remained limited. There was an awareness, unspoken but widely felt, that something significant was unfolding, even if its full dimensions were not yet visible. And at the center of it, Andrew remained, not removed, not yet, but undeniably affected. Because whatever came next would not be determined by reaction alone. It would be shaped by forces already in motion. Forces that, once set into place, do not easily change direction. And within that reality, his response, however measured, would have to find its place. A monarchy under pressure. As the situation continued to unfold, the pressure did not remain confined to Andrew alone. It expanded, quietly at first. Then with increasing clarity, it began to settle over the institution itself, because what had emerged was no longer a contained issue tied to one individual. It had begun to raise broader questions. Questions about oversight, about judgment, about the ability of the monarchy to manage not only its present image, but its unresolved past. Inside Buckingham Palace, that shift was understood immediately. The concern was not simply reputational in the traditional sense, it was structural. The monarchy relies on continuity, but also on coherence. And when elements of its narrative begin to conflict, even subtly, that coherence can begin to weaken. The newly surfaced material had not yet reached a point of full public exposure, but it had reached enough visibility to create movement, enough to prompt inquiry, enough to invite interpretation beyond the palace's control. And that was where the pressure began to build. Meetings became more frequent, not chaotic, not reactive, but more tightly spaced. The intervals between briefings shortened. Updates were requested with greater urgency. The flow of information, once measured and deliberate, began to move with a sharper edge. That's because the situation was no longer static. It was developing. Legal advisors remained central to the process. Their role had expanded beyond assessment into guidance. What could be addressed? What should remain untouched? What language, if any, could be used without creating further exposure? Every option carried risk. To engage too directly would invite deeper scrutiny. To remain too distant would invite assumption. And between those two positions lay a narrow path that required careful navigation. Communications teams faced a similar challenge. The initial statement had done what it was designed to do. It acknowledged awareness without amplifying detail. It established presence without inviting escalation. But statements of that nature are not endpoints. They are pauses. And as the situation continued to evolve, the question became whether that pause could be sustained. Externally, the tone of inquiry was changing. What had begun as cautious reference was becoming more defined, not yet aggressive, but more confident. Journalists were no longer simply asking if there was more to the story. They were beginning to suggest that there was. And suggestion, when repeated, all begins to take on the shape of expectation. Within the palace, this was recognized as a critical phase, because expectation, once established, drives momentum. And momentum, once gained, is difficult to slow. The king's position remained steady. Those close to the internal discussions would later describe a tone of quiet resolve. There was no visible frustration, no indication of alarm, but there was clarity. The institution would not be drawn into reactive engagement. It would not respond to every development. It would not allow its direction to be dictated by external pacing. Instead, it would hold. But holding position does not remove pressure, it concentrates it. The Princess Royal maintained her characteristic approach. Practical, unwavering, focused not on perception, but on outcome. For her, the issue was not the existence of pressure, but how it was managed, whether the response aligned with long-term stability rather than short-term relief. Prince William's role, though less visible, carried equal weight. His focus remained forward-facing. The monarchy he would one day lead was not the same as the one that had existed decades earlier. Expectations had shifted, tolerance had narrowed, and within that environment, unresolved questions carried greater consequence than they once might have. That understanding shaped his position, not reactive, but firm. The broader institution began to adjust around these positions. Advisors recalibrated their approach. Internal communication became more streamlined, more deliberate. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis, ensuring that consistency was maintained across all levels of response. Because inconsistency, even in tone, can create openings, and openings in moments like this are quickly exploited. beyond the palace walls, the sense of something building continued to grow. Not explosively, but steadily. A story not yet fully told, but clearly moving toward greater visibility. And within that movement, the monarchy found itself in a familiar but increasingly complex position. Balancing tradition with adaptation, control with transparency, silence with acknowledgement. Each choice carried consequence. Each decision shaped what would come next. Because the pressure was no longer theoretical. It was present. It was active, and it was no longer confined to the past. It had become part of the present, and in time, it would shape the future. But the fallout that can no longer be contained by the second week of March 2026, the shift that had begun in silence could no longer be held within it. What had started as controlled awareness inside Buckingham Palace had moved outward, step by step, until it reached a point where containment was no longer a strategy. It was a limitation. The material that had once been confined to internal review was now being referenced with increasing clarity. Not in full detail, not yet with complete cohesion, but enough to create alignment between sources that had previously operated in isolation. And once that alignment begins, it changes the nature of everything that follows. Because at that stage, the story is no longer being introduced. It is being confirmed. Across multiple platforms, the tone shifted from inquiry to assertion. Details that had once been cautiously phrased began to appear with greater confidence. Connections that had been implied were now being described with more direct language. Still measured, still careful, but no longer tentative. Inside the palace, the response did not accelerate. It tightened. The structures already in place were reinforced rather than expanded. Legal oversight increased. Internal communication narrowed. Every movement became more deliberate, more precise. Because in moments like this, control is not maintained through expansion. It is maintained through discipline. But discipline does not stop momentum. And outside the palace, the momentum continued to build. The story, once fragmented, was now forming a shape that could be followed. Timelines were being reconstructed publicly, associations revisited. Questions that had once existed in separate contexts were now being asked together. And when questions begin to converge, they become harder to contain. For Andrew, the impact of that convergence became impossible to ignore. What had initially been presented to him as a developing situation was now something else entirely. It was active, not just within institutional review, but within public awareness. And that shift altered the nature of his position. Because once a narrative moves beyond internal control, it becomes less responsive to individual influence. It cannot be redirected through private conversation or managed through selective engagement. It follows its own course. Inside Royal Lodge, the atmosphere reflected that reality. The earlier phases of reaction had given way to something more settled, but also more constrained. There were fewer attempts to challenge the situation directly, not because the desire had disappeared, but because the pathways through which challenge might be effective had narrowed significantly. The focus began to shift from resistance to assessment, from questioning the validity of what had surfaced to understanding the implications of what could no longer be dismissed, because by this point, dismissal was no longer viable. The material had moved too far. It had been seen, discussed, connected. And once that level of visibility is reached, the threshold changes. What matters is no longer whether something exists, it is how it is interpreted. At Buckingham Palace, the implications of that shift were fully understood. The initial strategy of controlled acknowledgement had served its purpose, but it could not extend indefinitely. A new phase was emerging, one in which silence, while still powerful, would no longer be sufficient on its own. The question was not whether further response would be required. It was when, and under what conditions. Because timing, as always, would determine impact. The king remained consistent in his approach. No reactive statements, no deviation from the established tone. But within that consistency, there was movement. Preparations, subtle but significant, began to take shape behind the scenes, not for immediate release, but for eventual necessity. Because the palace understood something fundamental. The situation had reached a point where outcome would not be determined by whether the story continued. It would be determined by how the institution responded when it did. The Princess Royal maintained her focus on structure and consequence. Prince William remained aligned with the long view, where clarity and accountability would define the future of the monarchy more than preservation of past arrangements. And together, those positions formed the framework within which the next decisions would be made. Beyond the palace, the narrative continued to expand, not explosively, but persistently. Each new reference reinforcing the last, each connection adding weight, until what had once been a contained issue became something broader, something that could no longer be held within a single boundary. And in that expansion, the nature of the situation changed once again. This was no longer about exposure alone. It was about consequence. Because once a past resurfaces with this level of cohesion, it does not simply exist alongside the present. It reshapes it. It redefines the terms on which it is understood. And it forces decisions that, until that moment, could be deferred. As night fell over London, the outward calm remained. The palace stood as it always had, unmoved, controlled, measured. But beneath that surface, the reality had shifted. The line between past and present had blurred. The space for containment had narrowed. And the outcome, whatever form it would take, had already begun to move into view. Because some moments do not announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly. They unfold gradually. And by the time they are fully recognized, they have already changed everything.